watching the award-winning GHS-TV, a nationally recognized student television station.
Hello and welcome to this week's special edition of GHS-TV's award-winning talk show Crosstalk. I'm your host, Madisyn Rix. Each week we discuss topics important to our diverse community. While you may not recognize the name Jesse J. Holland right off the bat, you have seen his work in print and on the big screen. The Memphis native is a host on C-SPAN's Washington Journal, professor at George Washington University, and an award-winning journalist and author. Two of his books provided the backstory for Finn from Star Wars: The Force Awakens and The Black Panther. Yes, The Black Panther. He continues to dominate his career, paving the way for African-American journalists and authors. I'm so excited Mr. Holland is joining us for the entire show to talk about his life and career, and maybe inspire fledgling journalists and authors. He joins me virtually from Washington, D.C. Hi, Mr. Holland. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
While you were born in Holly Springs, Mississippi, you were raised in Memphis, more specifically in the Orange Mountain area. Can you tell me a little bit about your childhood?
Well, like you said, I was born in Holly Springs, Mississippi. The same month I was born, my parents moved from Holly Springs to downtown Memphis. Like you said, specifically the Orange Mountain neighborhood. So I grew up in downtown Memphis. I attended both Hanley and Sea Isle elementary schools. But when I was in second grade, my parents moved back to Holly Springs. So I finished up actually at H.W. Byers High School in Mount Pleasant. But my father continued to teach in Memphis. So my father taught at Tresvant, Treadwell, and Melrose. So my connections to the Mid-South and the Memphis area are very strong.
Growing up in the 70s, in that period of time, there was still a lot of prejudice against African Americans. What influence did that have on you and your career?
Well, I was lucky enough to go to a school that was majority Black. And on top of that, my mother was my English teacher in 7th and 8th grade. So I had a lot of support growing up in Mississippi at that time. I then decided to go to school at the University of Mississippi, better known as Ole Miss, and that was my awakening to what the real world was like. I developed so many great friends during my time at the University of Mississippi, but it also helped open my eyes to what racism was really like. I have to admit that I went through several episodes at Ole Miss where the racism was blatant. But I also learned that there were good people in this world, just as there are racist people in this world. And frankly, that's what the world is like, honestly. You're going to run into some people who are just evil. Just no two ways to put it, but you're going to run into some people who are evil, but you're going to run into a lot of good people. And you have to stick with those good people as much as you can.
Your family owned farms in Marshall and Benton counties in Mississippi. You could have joined the family business, but instead pursued journalism. Why?
Well, to be honest, I am still in the family business because my mom always wanted to be an author. So I actually am doing the thing that my mom wanted to do. But of course, growing up in Mississippi in the 50s and 60s, there weren't many opportunities for Black women to become authors. There were some who could and did, but my mom unfortunately would never finish her first book. She started writing on it, but she never finished it. So I am still in the family business in the fact that I'm a writer. And of course, I still visit my family's farm as much as I can. At heart, I will always be a Mississippi farm boy. That's who I am. That's where I grew up. But it's not all I am. I can also be an author. I can also be a TV host. I can also be a professor. Never let anyone tell you the one thing you have to be. You can be as many things and whatever you want to be.
When were you first introduced to journalism?
That's a really good question. I've been in journalism so long, I actually don't remember the very first time I got into it or what even attracted me to it. But I can tell you that some of my first journalistic stories were actually printed in the South Reporter newspaper, which is the newspaper in Holly Springs, Mississippi. I actually started out covering my own high school, basketball and other sports at that school. Nobody else was doing it, so I decided to do it. And so that's where, if you went back into the archives of the South Reporter right now, you'll see some of my very first attempts at writing journalistically from there. And from there, I ended up going to the University of Mississippi on a journalism scholarship. So I started writing for the student newspaper, the Daily Mississippian, and writing for the newspaper of Oxford, Mississippi, which was called the Oxford Eagle. I've been in journalism for so long, I can't even remember what even attracted me to it. But one of the things I can tell you is that if you want to be any type of writer, you have to practice. You have to actually develop the skills. And one of the best ways for any writer to develop the skills and discipline to write is through writing for a newspaper. So that's what I decided to do.
As you mentioned earlier, after high school, you went to the University of Mississippi for journalism. While there, you became only the second African-American editor of the daily campus newspaper, the Daily Mississippian. Did that distinction influence you as an editor?
Well, I have to honestly say no, because I was the second Black editor. The pressure always comes on the person who is the first, because they have a lot to live up to. For example, right now, Vice President Kamala Harris is the first woman to be vice president, as well as the first Black woman, as well as the first Asian American woman. She has a lot of pressure on her because everyone's watching her to see what she's going to do and how it shapes the future of that position. For me, the first Black editor of the Daily Mississippian was a guy named Lee Eric Smith, who was also from Holly Springs. I actually was on his staff that year, and I got to see the pressure he was under to get everything right and not to have anyone complain that his race had anything to do with what he was doing. By the time I became editor of the paper, that was 4 years later. There was no novelty in having an African-American editor of the newspaper. I was free to be the best editor I could be and not have to worry about history or a legacy.
Mr. Holland, we're going to pause for a quick break. Up next, we'll dive into Jesse J. Holland's award-winning career in journalism.
You're watching the award-winning GHS-TV, a nationally recognized student television station.
Welcome back. From interning at the Associated Press to guest anchoring on C-SPAN, Jesse J. Holland has had an extensive career in journalism. Let's continue our conversation. Mr. Holland, you started your career before you even graduated from Ole Miss. Can you talk about what you learned at the Oxford Eagle?
Well, I absolutely loved my time at the Oxford Eagle. It was actually my first professional job, my first internship. I worked there for a summer and then continued to work there during the college semester. I met and worked with so many great writers and editors. One of the things that I did learn that is a lot different being a student journalist and being a professional journalist. When you're a student journalist, you're only doing it for grades. You have a support network behind you of professors and teachers. People are forgiving. If you make a mistake, they might grade you down, but nobody comes to yell at you. If you're a professional journalist, you have thousands and thousands of people reading what you did. And if you make a mistake, your editor might frown at you, but you might have a lawyer come visit you. You might have an angry politician coming to visit you. You might have an angry parent coming to visit you. One of the things that I really did learn while working at the Oxford Eagle is to be 100% confident that your facts are correct. Even today, I remember the parent who came to me at the newspaper. I had covered a high school football game the night before. And according to the parent, I shorted her son, the running back, by 1 yard. And she wanted that 1 yard in the newspaper. And I thought I was correct. She thought she was correct. But you haven't lived until you've encountered an angry high school football parent. So I learned to be 100% accurate as much as I can with everything that I do. There's no way that you can be perfect in everything that you do, but you can double check and you can be as sure as you can be with all of your facts when you're a journalist.
You had a few internships, as you mentioned before, landing at the Associated Press in 1994, where you worked for the next 25 years. What made you stay so long?
Because I just loved it. One of the great things about the Associated Press, and for those of you who don't know, the Associated Press is the world's largest news organization with bureaus in all 50 states. One of the great things about the Associated Press was that the company was so large that they offered so many different things that I could do. I started out as a journal assignment reporter, and then became a legal reporter covering courts, then became a political reporter covering the governor and the state house. Then I got a chance to go up to New York and cover Hillary Clinton's first Senate campaign. And directly after that, I got a chance to cover the White House, then the Supreme Court, then back to Congress, then a feature writer. So one of the reasons why I stayed with AP for so long was because AP allowed me opportunities to do things that I wasn't doing the day before. And every day, I never knew what I might be doing. One day I could be covering Clemson football, and the next day I'm covering Barack Obama at the White House. And the next day I'm at the Supreme Court. Or the next day I'm watching Michael Jackson testify in front of Congress. All of these things just kept my interest.
In your first few years with the AP, you covered a high-profile trial in South Carolina, earning you the Associated Press Managing Editor's John L. Dougherty Excellence Award. What impact did the award have on your career?
Well, it definitely brought attention to the work I was doing. This was actually in my first year in joining the Associated Press. I had just graduated from Ole Miss in 1994. And that first year was when Susan Smith drowned her children in a lake in South Carolina, but went to the police and claimed she had been carjacked by a black man, which caused a nationwide manhunt for someone who didn't exist, all in an attempt by her to hide the fact she had murdered her own children. Now, by the way, this to be clear, that was a tough story to cover for anyone, much less someone who had just graduated college. But I was lucky enough that I had a great editor and I had great colleagues at work who were able to help me through the process. And winning that award helped me realize that I could be whatever type of writer I wanted to be.
You most notably were the race and ethnicity reporter for the AP, covering and analyzing stories across the country. This is a big responsibility. Did it ever weigh heavy on your shoulders?
It 100% did. I was transitioning from covering the Supreme Court to a job covering race and ethnicity in the United States. And my intention in that job was to analyze historical events and talk about how they influence America today. Things like the Tulsa Race Massacre, things like the Fort Pillow Massacre, things like the Great Migration. That was my intention with that job. But 2 months after that job, 2 months after I take that job, was when Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson, Missouri. And for the next 5 years, I'm flying from state to state, dealing with the shooting of African American men and women by police in the United States, going from Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, to Freddie Gray in Baltimore, to up to New York City, to Tamir Rice in Cleveland. So instead of doing the analysis I had planned to do, I ended up writing about the thing that was actually going on in the country. So after 5 years of covering all of the things that were going on around the United States, I decided to step away for a while to work on my next book. And once I stepped away, I realized that, I actually enjoy my new life as a writer and a professor. So that's what I'm doing now.
At some point, you transitioned to on-air work at C-SPAN. How did that opportunity come about, and what were some of the challenges?
Well, I was a guest on several television shows as a print reporter, including on CNN and on MSNBC. And I was a guest on a show in Washington called Washington Journal, especially back when I covered the Supreme Court and Congress. And I really enjoyed it. So one day I get a call from the executive producer of the show, and who says to me, "Hey, we really like what you're doing on air. Have you ever thought about hosting?" So I went in, tried out, and I thought I did horribly, but they seemed to have liked whatever it was I was doing. So they offered me the chance to host Washington Journal on C-SPAN. Now, the hardest transition that I ran into, but moving from a print reporter to a host, is that for the first time, I had to be concerned about what I looked like. Nobody cares what print reporters look like, because all you read is our words in the paper or our words on a website. But when you're doing television, you have to be a little bit more concerned about how you present, how loudly you speak, whether you talk in your Southern accent or not, or you talk in a neutral tone, and you have to be sure you don't interrupt the guests, even though you might have a burning question. And as a print reporter, if I have a burning question, I'm going to interrupt you and ask it. You can't do that on television. So it took a while for me to get used to the ebb and flow of being on television. And I also have to add, as a man, I also had to learn makeup. That was the one thing that nobody ever talks to print reporters about. Nobody tells you about concealers. Nobody ever tells you about your head shining on air. So I had to learn how to do my own makeup, because I work on Saturdays. The makeup people work Monday through Friday. So I didn't have anyone to do it for me, so I had to learn how to do it myself. Once I figured out the makeup part, I think I had the rest of it locked down. I still love doing it. I still host Washington Journal on Saturdays now. I do still love it. I'm learning something new every day. And that's something that I always tell people. If you're not learning something, you need to move on. I'm still learning something new about television every weekend that I'm on C-SPAN. That's why I still love doing it.
Mr. Holland, we had to pause for another break. Don't leave yet. When we return, we'll talk Marvel, Star Wars, and the culmination of Mr. Holland's childhood dream.
You're watching the award-winning GHS-TV, a nationally recognized student television station.
Welcome back to Crosstalk. African American representation in sci-fi films has always been lacking, but that is starting to change with the introduction of Finn in Star Wars The Force Awakens and The Black Panther. Jesse J. Holland had a hand in bringing these character stories to life. He joins us once again from Washington, D.C. Mr. Holland, you wrote The Black Panther, Who is the Black Panther, in conjunction with the release of the movie. How did you get involved in the project?
Oh, that's a long story, but I won't take you all the way through the trials and tribulations. Well, but I will tell you this. I have always been a comic book and science fiction fan. In fact, the very first movie I ever saw in my entire life was the original Star Wars, and I saw it in Memphis, Tennessee. And that was the first movie I ever saw in a movie theater. So I ended up being approached by Lucasfilm to write a Star Wars novel. So I ended up writing a book called Star Wars: The Force Awakens, Finn's Story, that came out in conjunction with Star Wars: The Force Awakens. Now, Lucasfilm is owned by Disney, which also owns Marvel. So when Finn's Story came out, it got great reviews. So I ended up getting a call from Marvel saying, hey, there's this new movie coming out in a couple of years called Black Panther. We don't know if you know who Black Panther is. And of course, it sounds funny to say that now, but in 2016, there were people who had no idea who the Black Panther was. But I was not one of those people. I've been a comic book fan since the early 70s. So I've said, of course I know who the Black Panther is. Then they asked me to write a book that would introduce the character to people who had never heard of him. There have been Black Panther comic books for years. In fact, there had been a Black Panther animated series on BET, but there had never been a book that explained who the Black Panther was and what his origin was. So at this time, Ryan Coogler is making the Black Panther movie. Ta-Nehisi Coates is writing the Black Panther comic book. But Marvel said, we don't want what you're doing to be influenced by either one of those things. We want you to come up with your own universe, and we want you to base it on work that had been done by famed director Reginald Hudlin. So at the same time, there are three Black men writing some form of Black Panther. Ryan Coogler is writing the movie. Ta-Nehisi Coates is writing the comic book. I'm writing the book. None of us talk to each other because we didn't want any of our stuff influencing anyone else. We didn't want anyone else's stuff influencing us. So my Black Panther book was the first on the market. But of course, then the movie came out and everything just explodes. Everything just goes crazy. So it was a great experience, and I've gotten to be friends with several people who were in the movie as well, including another Memphian named Carrie Ann Burnens, who was actually one of the Dora Mahali warriors in the movie. So it definitely opened doors for me when it comes to my fiction writing.
As you mentioned earlier, you also wrote the backstory for the character Finn in Star Wars: The Force Awakens, which is huge all by itself. How did you get connected to that project?
Well, I was lucky enough that during my time as a reporter in New York, I ran across an editor at a small independent publishing house. She and I became friends. And it turns out, while she was a small independent publisher in New York, she moved out to San Francisco and became the editor-in-chief of Lucasfilm Publishing. So she and I have lunch, we laugh, we talk about old times. And I remember saying to her, if there's ever any Star Wars writing you need done, I'm your man. Well, about 4 years later, I'm at LSU at a journalism conference, and my phone rings, and it's this editor, and she says, you remember when you said if I ever need anything? Well, I need something. And I was like, well, what are we talking about? She was like, well, you know that there's a new Star Wars movie coming out called The Force Awakens. We want someone to write a book based on one of those characters. And I said, let me think about it. Okay. So it's just amazing. It's one of those things that I tell people, especially as journalists, you never burn bridges because you don't know what that person is going to be in the future. You try to be nice to everyone. You never know what that person is going to be 10 years from now. So do your best to be as nice and professional with everyone as you can, because you never know what opportunity you may be cultivating for yourself in the future.
Now I want to turn to your nonfiction work, which has also garnered a lot of praise. Black Men Built the Capitol, Discovering African American History and in around Washington, D.C. was released in 2007. What inspired you to tackle such a hard topic?
One of the things that I always tell people is that as a Southerner, we Southerners are obsessed with history. Because first thing we always want to know is, who are your people? Where are your people from? In Washington, it's more like, well, what do you do for a living? In the South is, who are your people? So we're obsessed with history. So when I moved to Washington in 2000, I wanted to know the history of Washington. And not just the history of the nation's capital, but the history of the people of the nation's capital. And for years, Washington was an African-American majority city, which made me wonder, well, if it's an African-American majority city, well, what did African-Americans contribute to the U.S. Capitol? What did they contribute to the White House? What did they contribute to the National Mall? And I kept hearing all of these stories about things that African-Americans did, including helping construct the Capitol and the White House. But then when I wanted to find a book to confirm these things, I quickly discovered no one had ever written one. So I took it upon myself to start writing some of these stories down, but not just writing them, confirming them to where they become more than just stories. They become factual parts of American history.
10 years later, you released The Invisibles, African American Slavery Inside the White House, which was awarded a silver medal in U.S. history from the Independent Publishers Association. What did you learn while researching this book?
Well, that book is actually a continuation of Black Men Built the Capitol. Well, while discovering and exploring the construction of the U.S. Capitol, which was done by enslaved Africans, I also discovered that enslaved Africans were used in the construction of the White House. But not only were they used in the construction of the White House, they were also held in bondage inside the White House. But that wasn't the focus of my first book. It was a little factoid that just stayed in my head for years. And then I finally decided that it deserved its own book. People knew about it. I wasn't telling people something that they had never envisioned could be true. It was just that no one ever thought about it. We know that George Washington's a slave owner. We knew Thomas Jefferson was a slave owner. We knew James Madison was a slave owner. But what did they do with their slaves while they were president? They didn't just leave them at home. They brought them to Washington and they lived in the White House with the president. There are tons of books about the presidents. I wasn't interested in what the presidents thought. What I was interested in was what happened with the slaves. Where did they come from before they got to the White House? What did they do while they were at the White House? Where did they go when their president left the White House? Those were the stories that interest me. So I spent about 10 years doing research on that topic. And once again, The Invisibles, the untold story of African-American slaves in the White House, was the result.
Mr. Holland, this was a wonderful conversation. Thank you for taking the time out of your day to talk to me about your life and your career.
Thank you. And I have to do one quick pitch. I have a new book out now called Black Panther: Tales of Wakanda. You can find it on bookstores right now, where you can find another story written by me about the Black Panther, along with stories from 17 other writers exploring the world of Wakanda. So if you like Black Panther and you're looking forward to the next Black Panther movie, Black Panther: Wakanda Forever, you can find out who these characters are that they'll be using in that movie in this book right now.
If you would like to know more about Mr. Holland or check out some of his books, visit his website, jcjholland.com. And for more information on our programming, go to GHS-TV.org, where we are streaming live 24 hours a day. You can also check us out on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. I'm Madisyn Rix. From all of us here at GHS-TV, thank you for watching Crosstalk, and I hope to see you again.